Now, moral imagination, chapter 12. We're going to zip through these last few chapters. And chapter 11. Chapter 12.
We just finished 11.
Yeah. Moral imagination. Actually, the beginning of the chapter is very clear. When he starts dealing with Darwinism, it gets hard. But basically, because what we have time to do is to look at the basic idea, he says, what we need is, he says, free spirits act out of their impulse, that is, from intuitions chosen by their thinking from the totality of the world of ideas. The reason that unfree spirits separate particular intuitions from their world of ideas to make them the basis of an action lies in what the perceptual world has given them, that is, their previous experiences. Before coming to a decision, unfree spirits remember what someone did or recommended, or what God commanded in such a case, and so forth. Then they act accordingly. Those are unfree spirits, right? Free spirits have other sources of action than these preconditions. Free spirits make absolutely original decisions. They worry neither about what others have done in their situation, nor about what they've been commanded to do. Purely conceptual reasons move them to select a particular concept from a sum of their concepts and translate that concept into action. Their action, however, belongs to perceptible reality. Once they act, they're participating in the same world of reality that the rest of the perceptual world is. What they perform there will thus be identical to a quite specific perceptual content. The concept, then, the moral concept, will have to realize itself in a concrete individual event. The painting of Starry Night by Van Gogh, for example. Yeah? But as a concept, it cannot contain that event. It can only relate to it as any concept relates to the percept. So the link mediating between a concept and a percept is the mental picture. The mental picture links between the concept and the percept because it has an aspect of the percept and a specific idea that we associated with it. Yeah? The mental picture. Right? Now, for the unfree spirit, this link of the mental picture is given in advance. Motives are present in advance as mental pictures in our consciousness. This is what I'm supposed to do. Yeah? Not because I love it, but because this is what I've seen other people do and this is what I've been told I'm supposed to do. Therefore, I'm doing my duty. Yeah? Authority, therefore, works best through examples, through the transmission of quite specific individual acts to the consciousness of unfree spirits. A Christian acts less in accordance with the teachings than the model of the Redeemer. With regard to positive action, rules have less value than they do for the restraint of particular actions. Laws concerning what unfree spirits must be given to them in quite concrete form: clean the street in front of your doorway, pay your taxes at this rate at tax office on April 15th, and so forth. The laws forbidding actions take on conceptual form. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. But these laws too affect unfree spirits only by their appeal to concrete mental pictures, such as that of the corresponding secular punishment, torments of consciousness, eternal damnation, and so forth. Yeah? Now, so he said the translation of a concept into a mental picture is always necessary for a free spirit, who is driven neither by a model nor a fear of punishment. So if we are not going to just do what others have told us to do, we need to be able to translate a moral concept into an imagination. The imagination will be how the idea begins to live in the world of percepts and concepts. So what we need is the capacity for imagination. Okay? Imagination is the chief means by which human beings produce concrete mental pictures from the sum of their ideas. Free spirits need moral imagination to realize their ideas and make them effective. Moral imagination is the source of the free spirit's actions. Therefore, only people who have moral imagination are really morally productive. Moral preachers, people who spin out codes of ethics without being able to condense them into real mental pictures, are morally unproductive. They're like critics who can rationally discuss what works of art should be like, but cannot themselves produce anything at all. To turn a mental picture into a reality, moral imagination must set to work in a specific field of percepts. Human action does not create percepts, it recasts already existing percepts and gives them new form. So when Franklin Wright saw the waiters and the waitresses carrying the tray, he translated an idea of the cantilevered tray into a building that would project itself out over the waterfall. Yeah. But he needed imagination to do that. He didn't build a tray of food over the waterfall. He translated the idea of the cantilever into a building, you see? Now, but he needed an imagination to do that. So, I'm going to move the word moral concept. I'm not going to remove it. I'm just going to move it slightly to a different position so I can insert one more item up here, which is moral imagination. Okay, don't be upset. So moral concept, moral intuition brings about a moral concept. But the moral concept is a potential. It's an idea. It's an idea. But the idea will only find validity if I can translate it into an imagination that can actually live in the world of percepts and concepts. So what I need, just as a mental picture has a little bit of the percept and a little bit of the concept still related to me, a moral imagination is the equivalent of a mental picture. Moral imagination actually lives up here. Moral imagination is the equivalent of a mental picture, but it is my ability to imagine how this idea might find roots and wings and live in the world of reality. So moral imagination, the moral concept will guide my imagination to say, I have an idea of cantilevering a building out over something. Here is a waterfall. The client is actually not asking me to project it. In fact, falling water, you'll find falling water, the owner of the property didn't want Franklin Wright to put the house where he put it. He actually wanted him to put it up the hill looking down at the waterfall. And Franklin Wright had to convince him, no, that'll shade the waterfall and you're going to ruin, it's on the north slope and it's too cold. What you want to do is you want to actually build the house projecting out over the water. So Franklin Wright had to sell ice he could sell ice to the Eskimos. He was a very convincing personality. So he had his way with this poor guy and built this building as a kind of tour de force, but it's an amazing building. So anyway, he translated his moral concept or his idea, he had to translate it into an imagination, and the imagination then had to be translated into concepts and percepts. Okay? Now the moral imagination would be the sketch in the case of an architect. Yeah? The architect has an idea. Here's an idea of a building hovering out over a waterfall with cantilever balconies, and all the anchors, all the fingers supporting that building are back underneath the building, and all you really see is this glorious hovering terrace, a series of terraces hovering out over the waterfall. Beautiful imagination. It will look like it's just jutting out of the hill. You won't even see the supports because they're tapered back, you see? Mm-hmm. So all this is perfectly valid. It's beautiful what he did. But he had to convey that to the engineers who somehow had to figure out, okay, how far and what material and what stresses. And so he had to translate that the engineers who would say, okay, you're going to cantilever that thing this far, and you can use reinforced concrete, and it's going to be this wide, and it's going to weigh this much, and therefore it's going to have to be, here's where the steel and the concrete has to go. So in other words, there had to be an idea of how that sketch could be realized, and he also had to be able to say, yes, and this is what it's going to look like, and no, I don't want it to be 5 feet, I want it to be 20 feet. I don't want that overhang to be 5 feet, I want it to be 20 feet, 25 feet. Come on, let's go, what can you do, buddy? You know, so the percept, so basically translating that moral imagination into and pushing the limits of it meant that he had an idea of how that idea, what he wanted it to look like. He then had to convince the engineers and the owner, who also had to pay for the thing, small detail, to pay for the thing. So then he had to create, so he had, in other words, his moral imagination had to have something of an idea, and an idea which could be real, and an imagination which could inspire others and communicate to them perceptually what the thing was going to look like. Then that would inform the mental pictures that they would use to operate, to build the building by. I need to tell you one quick story. when Frank Lloyd Wright completed the building, the man who actually got the job as contractor didn't think the building was going to stand up. He'd never built a cantilever in his life. He got the job because he was a local contractor. But boy, he didn't think, he saw the sketch and he thought, that ain't going to stand up. Yeah, he was completely opposed to the building. So there he is, this local guy, kind of a bridge builder, but he never built a cantilever. No, this building's going to fall down. I know it. But he had to follow the exact orders of the engineers and so forth. So anyway, it came to the point when all the forms had been placed, all the concrete, the steel had been placed, the forms had been put into, the concrete had been poured, everything was drying. And now Frank Lloyd Wright had a young person, people paying to work for him there as a supervisor of the job. This is the way Frank Lloyd Wright operated. He got people to pay for him to pay him to work in his office and to learn from the master. So this guy calls up Frank Lloyd Wright, says the contractor refuses to take down the forms. He thinks the building's going to collapse. Frank Lloyd Wright said, "I'll be there tomorrow." So Frank Lloyd Wright gets on the train and he goes east, and he gets off the train, and he gets to the site. And so there's the contractor. You can imagine this big burly guy. I ain't taking down these forms. I'm not responsible for what happens here. And so Frank Lloyd Wright comes up. Frank Lloyd Wright is about 78 years old at this point. This is 1935. He was born in 1869. I mean, he's an old guy. So he walks up and says, "Where's the axe?" So Frank Lloyd Wright, this old man, begins chopping away the forms. And the contractor, you can see he's running for the hills. No, no, no. And in fact, he knocks down the supports and the forms fall away and the building stands there. And Frank Lloyd Wright tosses the axe. "I told you so." And walks away. This is Frank Lloyd Wright. You see, this is Frank Lloyd Righteous. So, but you see, he was so convinced that his idea was going to work, and he was himself a civil engineer. He was trained as he knew what he was doing, for goodness sake. You see, so his moral imagination had completely begun to solve the problems. And when he gave the directive to build the building, he knew the building was going to stand up. Even the contractor didn't know it would, but Wright was sure it would. So he had moral imagination and he had moral technique. Moral technique is a technical skill to realize in reality what's going to happen. So you need two things. You need moral imagination. You also need moral technique, technical skill to build the thing, to make it happen, moral technique. So moral imagination is equivalent on the creative side. Moral imagination is really the equivalent of the mental picture. But friends, the difference is, remember, the mental picture arises out of the percept that we perceived and the concept with which we thought. The mental picture happens after we've observed and thought. And imagination has to precede. It has to be a vision of how the idea, the concept, and the percept might come together. So imagination is a capacity to see something that isn't a percept. Yeah? You see the difference? So we can never form a mental picture because there's nothing there to start with. You have to start from your imagination, from your vision. So this is where creativity comes in. You have an imagination of the finished product. Then your task is to translate the imagination of the idea into working reality that will inform the mental pictures that will guide the contractors and the builders and the engineers to actually and the bill payers to make sure that the thing is going to happen as you wanted it to. Now the ideal, friends, would be if the same person had the capacity for moral intuition and moral imagination and the conceptual knowledge and could translate it directly through themselves as a technician. That would be pretty straightforward, yeah? It'd be nice if one person could do all of that. In the case of a building, that's not possible. It's possible in the case of a conceptual artist. A conceptual artist could, as an individual, perhaps do all those stages. But a building, you couldn't be a contractor, an engineer, and an architect and the owner all simultaneously. So it may be, friends, that you have a moral idea. Now, you can also work with other people who have the capacity for moral imagination. It may be that you have a great moral intuition. You say, you know what this world really needs is, and you come up with some idea that's just absolutely outrageous. And you say, but I just can't figure out a way that that idea could ever come into reality. So what you need is, so you've got a moral concept, a moral intuition, but you can't translate it into a picture yet because you don't know enough about the way the world works. So you need to find somebody who knows the way the world works, who can dream along with you and willing to take your concept and begin to say, well, you know what, that could work in this situation. If we did this and this, means it could begin to look up, oh yeah, I can see that. You see? So a person who has a moral imagination can assist a person who has moral intuition to begin to realize the possibility of the thing, and then you can turn it over to other people. But of course, the more people you turn it over to, the chances are of the idea being watered down or altered. See, the chances of the pure moral conception being completely delivered at the end diminishes, in a certain sense, on how many other people you have to involve in it, unless they're really aligned with the idea themselves. Because let's face it, everybody wants to do their own piece. But we begin to see, friends, this is also part of the art of community, because we do things together, and we do things for each other. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't live in the building, he built it for other people. Although people say that Franco had only designed houses for himself, he actually wasn't very tall. I think it was about 5'4". So most of his doorways were 6 feet high. So I would bump my head, tough. You're not 5'4", what's your problem? So, now, the rest of the chapter on moral imagination is quite lovely, but he's going very much into Darwinism, and I think with the time left, we need to look at the chapter 13 and 14. Those are really the crucial chapters now.